Chair, speakers. So, Carl Jung describes shame as the soul-eating emotion. And shame is that kind of feeling of inadequacy we feel, that we feel flawed or defective. We feel that we feel unworthy of human connection. And shame is actually a healthy social emotion. It's actually to let us know where the limits are of things. If we go into a new environment, we feel shy, that's healthy shame. The problem is when a child is gone through chronic maltreatment, it becomes toxically shame. So I'm just going to explain the differences. So shame in and of itself, like I said, it shows us where our boundaries are. So when someone says no to us, you feel a little bit of shame. Or like if you go out unzipped, you feel a little bit of shame. And it's to let you know not to do it again, because it's to keep us in with a certain social structure. So the origins of toxic shame is when shame becomes internalized, and it becomes, as opposed to this kind of transient feeling, it becomes this permanent state of being where someone feels flawed and defective, and they feel unworthy of connection with a human being. So what usually happens is in our primitive years between 0 and 10, that's kind of when we're downloading our map of the universe. So we're usually learning at a more rapid rate, we're modeling our parents, but if our parents are shame-based, then we're literally modeling shame-based behavior. So they will actually parent us how their parents parented them. So this cycle is like a multi-generational thing. And what ends up happening is then through a series of abandonment and neglect, the child eventually becomes shame-based. And toxic shame is the motivator behind self-destructive behavior, violence, perfectionism. Just an example with perfectionism, something I really struggle with. It's a kind of a way to counterbalance self-hatred, that if you make everything else perfect, then you feel okay, if that makes sense. So what a child will go through in that kind of primitive years between 0 and 10 is that their kind of currency is love. They don't have a house, they don't have a car, they don't have any money, and they will do anything to get that love. They have to get them dependency needs met. So they have to get that through another guardian. So what ends up happening is, if the parent is shame-based, they will neglect the child. And what ends up happening is then that child will do anything to try and get that love. So this is where all these kind of distorted forms of attachments come from, whether that be perfectionism or joking, or if I'm a super achiever, the parent will like me. And this is where people find it really hard to kind of have a more flexible approach to life and stuff like that. So through that, what ends up happening is you have to develop defenses. So one of the things a child will do is they'll create a false self. So they'll create this idealized self. So just to give an example of my role in my family system, I was like an emotional caretaker. So to keep the stress down in my family system, I had to be there for my mum, my little brother, and then my dad. You might be also wondering as well that I do fitness, and now I'm talking about toxic shame. It's a little bit of a jump. The reason I mention it is because in 2013, I remember coming home from work. I was working 2 jobs, and I worked for myself. And I came out of work and I picked up the phone, and my mum's phoning me, and I'm like, why is my mum phoning me? And I come outside and I pick up the phone, and she said, and it was like almost like Satan just came out the other side of the phone. Like she was saying there was blood on the walls. She said lock the door to my little brother. And I'm thinking, what's going on? And I'm actually writing a book on this at the moment. I've actually called it Pandemonium, because that is literally what it sounded like. And said, you need to go to the nearest hospital as fast as possible, and I need to go. And she put the phone down. And then so I go to the nearest hospital, and then all of a sudden I go in, my little brother's there, there's 3 policemen, and then my mum is like around this corner with like a curtain. So I walk in, I can't talk to my little brother. So I go around, I open the curtain, it was actually like looking at the Passion of Christ, not to give you a traumatic image, but my mum had been completely beaten up, like slashed, and later that year, my dad actually got imprisoned for attempted murder for 18 years. So for me, looking back at it, I had to go back to that family of origin. I've always kind of unconsciously known there was something wrong. So for me, I had to go back and look at that. Why does that happen? And one of the actual coping mechanisms for toxic shame is rage. Because when you rage, you can mood alter, you can get out of your body. That's something you can do when you don't feel powerful, and you can feel powerful for a second. But to see that in someone else, you literally transfer that shame onto someone else, and you don't actually resolve it. It's just a temporary mood alterer. So for me, understanding that and understanding what my role was, something what I grasped onto, the way my ego coped when I was young, is that to play that caretaking role, I saw superheroes and I modelled superheroes. So if you think of that role, the hero always fights alone. He's always self-sacrificial. He's always courageous. He can't ask for help. And you can see how your ego, to make sense of that meaning of that role, that it will cope by making a story around it to make you feel like a bit more comfortable, to generate a bit more meaning. But the problem is, whatever your role was in the family system, you will carry that outside in the social realm, and you will find people who confirm that role to you. So you could literally go to your grave and never know who you truly are. And that's the essence of toxic shame, because you had to develop a false self. You can't get around it as a child. That parent is like God. So what people find is that you'll reconfirm that role, and you'll find familiarity in other people, and the word familiarity actually stems from the word family. So you could literally have this role your whole life and not really know your true identity. So for me, the next thing was I needed to try and develop a way to alleviate that shame, because a lot of people will find like addictions that will numb it out. Alcohol is very potent, smoking, eating, perfectionism, performance, because you get that temporary high when you perform. Like when you achieve that thing, you have like the big build-up peak, and then it drops, and then you do the next thing. And this is why people become like human doings as opposed to human beings. So for me, the thing I found out about shame was that it hates exposure. So if you expose it, it will go. So for me, going to like a 12-step program, talking about my fears, my shames with other people, getting very vulnerable around, I'm usually the youngest one in these meetings, and telling them like what I feel afraid of, what I'm most ashamed of and stuff like that, and it's like, oh my god, this is so scary. Like, I remember going to my first 12-step meeting and I was like, whoa, I'm going back out. And like, I just remember, like, it's quite unusual because it's like a lot of them are quite middle-aged people, and to tell your secrets to someone you don't even know is like, well, guys don't do vulnerability, we don't do that stuff, that's just like, so to that, but it's very alleviating. And another thing as well was angering. You find in a lot of family systems that they will shame your anger. If you come from a very shame-based family, this is usually more common in women because it's seen as more of a masculine trait or whatever it is, but you need your anger. You need your anger. That's like your protection. That's the emotion that helps us fight for our dignity as human beings. It's there to let us know and other people to know how to respect us. And if you don't have your anger available to you, you don't have your power. There's a reason you get angry when you're hungry. That's the drive to help motivate. So that would be the drive to go hunt in prehistoric times. So learning to express anger. I remember when I did my first anger and release session at home, and it was like all that shame was literally pushed out. You find that a lot of people with depression have depressed anger. Depressed actually means depressed down. So when you suppress your anger, if you don't express it, it gets turned towards the self. And the self is like the CEO of the personality. So it actually mutates into self-hatred, and it builds off itself. So that's kind of like the essence of like what I call healing toxic shame, and recovering that. And just to mention something else as well, I remember when I was in university, I know I spoke last time about the blue and the red pill in the Matrix. One of the big red pill moments for me was learning about something called codependency. This is something which is a little bit more, it came out in the 80s, and I thought it was like this relationship addiction. But what codependency is a lost relationship with the self. So what you have, if you're yourself, your CEO of your personality, in shame when you were young, you had to just adapt to your surroundings. You couldn't focus on your own internal cues. You had to just develop a false self. So I call it almost like the chameleon disease or shapeshifter syndrome, because you're always having to adapt. You can't be yourself, you can't be in your body. So learning about that, one of the biggest things what helped me was something called mental point of origin, making yourself your mental point of origin again. So your first thought should be yourself. It shouldn't be someone else. You should be prioritizing your needs first. Now, for some other people, that might be quite easy, but for me, that was incredibly difficult. So making myself my mental point of origin, expressing my anger, and then vocally ventilating to other people, and trying to alleviate that shame. And you find as that shame dissolves, you can release them ego defenses. You find that if you don't heal the shame, they've done studies on psychotherapy where they've gone and treated the guilt, which is a behavioural modification. So when people have, it's like when you do something wrong and you feel the need to say sorry, that's guilt. Shame is about being, guilt is about doing. And what they found in psychotherapy, when they tried to heal the guilt, their therapy went on and on and on. But when they healed the shame, the person recovered. So this is why we have to, especially not chronically shame children, because it just makes them addicts. It makes them very responsible for the violence. If you look at like Adolf Hitler, Robin Williams, these are addict-like people, Michael Jackson. So I'll just leave it there. And the realizing, for me anyway, it's like a kind of a multi-generational thing. So for me, it was important to kind of like break the cycle. So when I have kids, I can kind of model to them healthy behavior. So I'll just leave with like a little quote at the end. Heal the adult. Reverse that. Heal the child, empower the adult.